So there's a new Game of Thrones show going on, eh? As someone who loved the books and about 70% of the show, I'm vaguely interested. I mean, I still haven't watched it yet, but I probably will when it's finished and I can binge it all in a month or two. In the meantime though, with all this talk of dragons and the houses from which they are from, join me today as we make a diorama of one of the most important turning points in the history of Westeros. I'm Anders, and today we're going to be building the Battle of the Trident. The battle screamed about Lord Robert and Prince Rhaegar both, and by the will of the gods, or by chance, or perhaps by design, they met amidst the shallows of the ford. The two knights fought valiantly upon their destriers, according to all accounts, for despite his crimes, Prince Rhaegar was no coward. So first we need some kind of base, and since I wanted to keep this pretty small and compact, I grabbed a little picture frame from the dollar store. Starting off, I just got rid of the glass and removed any excess hardware before gluing the cardboard backing into the frame. I honestly didn't do too much planning here, as I had a really clear image in my head of how I wanted this to look, based on the artwork by Justin Sweet. We're going to be going for the two of them on horseback, charging towards one another across the shallows of the Trident. And so for the ground texture, I wanted to go for a fairly neutral riverbed look. And so I decided to actually avoid excess painting here and just glue down some suitably colored sand that I scooped off the side of the street. I then added a few tufts to one side of the board, the idea being that this was closest to the riverbank. And after locking that all into place with a bit more glue, we're basically done the base, as the only other thing we're going to be doing here is adding the water effects over top. And so with that done, it's onto the models, and for both Rhaegar and Robert, I decided to use the old plastic Bretonians from that 5th edition starter box. Between the original set and a few lots of random miniatures I've bought over the years, I've actually got quite a few of these lying around, and they perfectly fit into that classical knight aesthetic that I really love from a lot of Song of Ice and Fire artwork that the show never really captured for me. So getting right into it, we're starting with Rhaegar, and right off the bat, I wanted to make him look a bit different. I decided I wanted Rhaegar to look more heavily armored than Robert, and so switched out the head of the horse for one of these armored heads from an old Chaos Knight I had. I like the horns on this one as it kind of plays into that dragon theme, but I didn't notice until after the fact that there's actually a skull on the front, which I'm not crazy about, as I don't feel like that's very Rhaegar, but let's just say it was the Mad King who put it there. So after gluing that all together, I moved on to the body, which I did do quite a few subtle modifications to, as the original poses for these figures don't have a lot of expression to them. One nice thing about the kit though is it actually has two different dragon helmets, and I honestly couldn't decide which one I preferred. Ended up going with this one as I like the larger head on it, but I ended up actually cutting off the wings from the other one and attaching those to the sides to get that winged helmet look. To get away from the standard pose, I spent a while dry fitting the head against the body and cutting off big sections in order to have them fit at the angle I wanted them to before gluing it all together. I did the same thing with the arm as well, as I wanted it to be raised up, and cut off the hand and replaced it with a sword that I believe is actually from the Shield Wolf Valkyrie set, which I'm excited to still be getting use out of. With that done, I moved on to Robert, and he started out honestly pretty simple, with the horse just being assembled as normal, but when it got to the torso, I decided I didn't like all those dangles hanging off of the arms, and so cut off the left arm that was sculpted into the torso. I then replaced the arms with a set from the Frostgrave Warriors kit. For the helmet, I went pretty simple, just using the standard stag helmet from the Baratheon kit, as it just fit so nicely. And with a little bit of fiddling and cutting like on Rhaegar, I got it sitting at the angle I wanted it to. Then we came to the weapons, and in this case, I needed some kind of warhammer, as that's kind of Robert's thing. But I don't have a lot of hammers lying around. Not many of the kits I have include any. So I ended up finding one from, again, those old Chaos Warriors. And after cutting off the Chaos arrows from the sides, it looked pretty good. So I cut the hammerhead off and then attached it onto the shaft of a axe, once again from the Frostgrave Warriors kit, and attached that to the body. With the builds all good, I spent a while cleaning them up with some green stuff, and honestly this was pretty fiddly, so I didn't actually film it. The main things I did was just smoothing out Robert's shoulders, but for Rhaegar, I added a couple of extra plates of armor onto his thighs, and also roughly sculpted out a dragon for his chest. I felt like this really helped to make the torso look like it was wearing armor rather than a tunic, and also Robert smashing the dragon on Rhaegar's chest is such a critical part of the story that I just had to have it here. To finish them up, I also grabbed a couple of shields, namely a stag one from the Baratheon kit from Robert, and a plain longer one for Rhaegar from an old High Elf kit. Then I cut the tabs off of their feet and mounted them onto some wooden blocks with pins, which I could use afterwards to attach them to the actual bases. Then moving on to painting, I hit them with a simple zenithal highlight of black to white. So with both the primary colors on these guys being yellow and black, this was always going to be tricky, so I started with Rhaegar. I worked inside out here, starting with the horse, which I actually painted in quite a light color, as I knew the rest of the model was going to be pretty dark and I wanted to work in some contrast where I could. I then washed this down and highlighted it up with some off-white. As for all the black, I decided to split it up, namely painting the cloth in actually a very dark gray, and keeping the pure black for the armor itself. Then I painted all the extra little details and decorations in red, some exposed silver with gunmetal, and finally any leather straps with simple brown. For the highlighting, I started with the armor, and I went with a edge highlighting approach. The first one was a pretty messy dark gray edge highlight, but I mixed in more and more white and did smaller and smaller layers as I went along. Finally, I pushed the contrast on this by recessed shading with some pure black. As for the cloths, I did a combination of wet blending and rough layering by mixing in some darker gray into the recesses and working all the highlights up with more and more off-white. I painted the reds in the same way as this, and then for the browns, I just used my current favorite triads of brown paints from Citadel. Then I painted up the shield in the same way with a rough free-handed dragon sigil on it, before popping it off of its painting base and gluing it on to finish up Rhaegar. As for Robert, I once again started with the horse, going with a dark brown this time to once again contrast all the bright colors we'd be using. And by bright colors, I mean bright color, as so much of this model is yellow. I used the same approach here as I used on my Carterland warriors, namely by mixing up a darker orangey yellow for the recesses and a pure yellow on the raised edges before doing a rough wet blend between them. Because this is a little bit finicky time-wise, I only worked on 2 or 3 seconds at a time here, as this gave me enough time to work the blends before the paint dried, but giving it enough time to dry completely in order to do second coats, as the real issue here was the transparency of the paints, as I actually had to do 3 or 4 layers on here to get a good solid color. This actually worked out pretty nicely, as doing blends over blends like this actually helps to work up the overall effect, and while it's not perfect, I actually think it looks pretty good, and I genuinely kind of enjoy painting yellow in this way. It's really tedious and takes a long time, but it is kind of satisfying. And then the rest of him was honestly pretty straightforward. I picked out the other colors like blacks, silvers, gold, and browns for the leather, and then just highlighted them like I normally would, mixing in more and more off-white for the blacks, darkening the metals with some washes, and then once again highlighting the brown leather like I did on Rhaegar. Then once again I popped off his shield, glued it on, and he was done too. And with them both done, I was actually really happy with how they looked, so immediately cut them off of their bases and glued them down onto the diorama. Being somewhat careful here, I tried to think of all the different viewing angles for how these guys would look, trying to make sure that you could see both of the models no matter where you looked at the piece from. And also making it so that it looked like they were at least vaguely looking towards each other. And with all that done, it was time for the water effects, and for this I decided to use a Vallejo one that I just happened to have lying around. So I quickly mixed that up with some contrast paints to give it a kind of muddy brown color and poured that straight in. I was sure to keep a plastic tray underneath this and actually covered it while it was curing in order to make sure nothing got stuck inside of it, and I'm really glad I did this, as this leaked a lot. Like, I was really hoping that the super glue would be enough to actually keep everything together and stop it leaking out, but I was wrong. Almost all of it leaked out, and I had to do a second layer. But once that was done, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. So what do you think of this? Does this bring back memories of Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire? And have you seen the new show yet? Honestly, I know it's petty, but my biggest issue going into it is Matt Smith in that silly wig. But that is probably just me. I am a sucker for dragons though, so I'm definitely going to watch it eventually, as there's a lot of really cool looking ones on it. Especially this absolute Chad. So for now, thank you to everyone, and particularly my ever-present patrons, as you keep this ridiculous thing going, and I can never thank you enough for that. So be sure to like and share the video, but also make sure you're subscribed and you've got that whole notification thing done, because there's another big fantasy show coming out, and we may just have some plans for that as well. So make sure you don't miss that.